அதே சமயத்திலே தாங்கள் பிறந்த மண்ணையும் மறக்காமல் இந்த ஊரிலும் வந்து இங்கே இருப்பவர்களுக்கும் அவர்கள் உதவி செய்கிறார்கள் என்பதை பார்க்கும் பொழுது உண்மையிலேயே ரொம்ப மகிழ்ச்சியாகிறது. பல அரிய செய்திகளை அவர்கள் சொன்னார்கள். இத்தனை மருத்துவர்கள் படிக்கிறார்கள், இத்தனை மருத்துவர்கள் வேலை பார்க்கிறார்கள், இத்தனை பொறியாளர்கள் வேலை பார்க்கிறார்கள் என்ற செய்தியெல்லாம் நாம் ஒரு நண்பர் கேட்டது போல ஒரு சிறு அச்சம் இருந்தால் கூட அது போக்கிக் கொள்ளலாம் என்கிற வகையிலே ஆறுதலாக அவர்கள் கூறுகின்ற செய்தி தமிழர்கள் துணிந்து ஆஸ்திரேலியாவுக்கு படிக்க செல்லலாம் என்பதை எடுத்து காட்டுகிறது. அந்த வகையிலே அவர்களுக்கு நன்றி. அடுத்து ஐயா செல்வ கனகநாயகம் அவர்கள் ரீடிங் தி செகுலர் இன் த பல்லவா பீரியட் அந்த கட்டுரை படிப்பார்கள்.
Thank you all for being here. We moved quite quickly from the Sangam period to contemporary times, and I will try to move back somewhere in between to the Pallava period. My name is Chelva Kanaganayakam. I teach English at the University of Toronto, and at the University of Toronto, Canada, and I look after the Center for South Asian Studies. In the interest of time, I will move straight to my paper. I have tried to edit this within the last 1 hour or so to conform to 15 minutes, so there might be some discontinuity, but I'll try to get the argument across. There is a complex and often problematic relation between the chronological or temporal period that we call the Pallava period and the time frame we refer to as the Bhakti period in Tamilaham. While the two are now used interchangeably, particularly in recent literary histories, the fact is that the former can be substantiated more readily with historical records. The latter is at least partly conjectural, in that the notion of religiosity that frames the Bhakti period is predicated on a much later collection of religious texts. We know that for about 3 centuries, from about the 6th century to the 9th century CE, a large section of Tamilaham was ruled by the Pallava kings, and a smaller segment was ruled by the Pandya kings. We also know that this was a period when a large body of religious poetry was written, and these constitute a substantial corpus of religious poetry. Much of this poetry was temple or sthala based, and the poets who composed these poems often focused on specific temples to anchor their poetry. All 3 factors, the presence of the Pallavas, the burgeoning of religious poetry, and the emphasis on specific locales, taken together are suggestive of a particular kind of political and cultural intersection. The notion of religious efflorescence as a totalizing cultural phenomenon that worked in tandem with the political climate is probably a revisionist reading, in that it fails to address fully the relation between political change and cultural manifestation. And the question that I'm trying to pose here is whether there is a social dimension to this body of religious poetry. In other words, the question is, why did the gods become so important at a time of profound secular change, when a tribal society was giving way to a complex urban network of social relations? Is there a symbiotic relation between the two? It is now commonplace to reiterate that the poems that we call the Tirumurais or the Prabandhams were compiled and classified much later in the Chola period. The fact that these were anthologized at a time which witnessed the growing power of the Cholas compounds the problem of exegesis. The legends say that only the important poems were preserved by divine intervention, and that seems to suggest that much more might have been written during the Pallava period and may not have been preserved. It is conceivable that much of the secular poetry might have disappeared over time. Particularly texts that praise the Pallavas may have been ignored or deliberately destroyed. What is important, however, is that the later compilation gives Bhakti poetry a coherence that may not have existed when the poems were composed. It is conceivable that the real nature of the Pallava period might have been obscured by the imposition of a Bhakti framework upon it. To say this is not to be dismissive of the tremendous and unique achievement of the period. At least in Tamil literary history, the burgeoning of religious literature at this time needs to be seen as a watershed. There is no doubt that a large number of temples were built and an impressive body of poetry was composed. My concern in this paper is the implicit connection that we make between the Pallavas and the growth of Bhakti. We take for granted the symbiotic relation between the two, and that is supported by the hagiographical evidence in, say, Periyapuranam. We are told that kings renounced their faith in Jainism and embraced Saivism. It is certainly possible that without the support of the rulers and landlords, temples could not have been built or maintained on such a large scale. That said, it still remains unclear as to why the kings invested so much money on temples and land grants, and how their interest was transformed into a populist movement. We do not know for sure whether religion became a populist affair during this time. But certainly the structure of the poetry, the metrical patterns, the stanzaic forms seem to suggest that this poetry was not intended to be appreciated by the educated few. Whether bhakti was actually conceived of as a movement is not evident from the poetry. We know that from the poetry that people gathered around in temples for festivals and rituals. But the juxtaposition of bhakti and movement suggests a unity and coherence that might not have existed. There is obviously a sense of intersection among poets and an awareness of genealogy, but beyond that, the contours are unclear. Apart from the material that looks at bhakti literature as religious writing, what really is the relation between this large body of literature and the growing urbanization of Tamilagam? We know from the work of scholars that large grants were given in order to sustain temples, and these large grants enabled agriculture on a scale that allowed for surplus produce and the consequent transformation of society. It is clear from historical evidence that a tribal structure was beginning to give way to a feudal or urban structure in which the temple remained a constitutive element. And yet, a number of questions remain unanswered. Why did the poets choose to write about gods rather than ordinary people? Particularly when they drew their imaginaries from a literary tradition that had clearly upheld the secular. It is true that the religious impulse was clearly present in Tamilagam before the Pallavas took control, but certainly the proportions were different, and the Sangam tradition of literature evolved in the post-Sangam period in ways that allowed for the coexistence of the sacred and the secular. Now the pendulum swings dramatically in favor of the religious. We do not often emphasize that the Pallavas were outsiders who did not speak the language of the people. The court language was probably Sanskrit. There was very little to connect them with the people they ruled. If religion was seen as a possible common ground, then it would stand to reason that the huge investment on religion was also an attempt to find an area of commonness. Various religions from the north had already entrenched themselves in the south, and the religious feuds imply that religion was fast becoming a contentious area in Tamilagam. Seen in this light, the decision to create a whole economy around temples was probably as much a religious as an ideological decision. The temple was a place where everyone could come together, erasing or